The man whose signature is required to close the Strait of Hormuz is 85 years old, has not appeared in public for 11 days, and the hospital wing at Imam Khomeini Medical Complex in Tehran has been sealed to all visitors except his immediate family and the commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. That fact alone is worth sitting with for a moment, because what happens in that hospital room in the next 72 hours does not stay in Tehran. It travels at the speed of financial markets to Dubai, to Singapore, to Tokyo, to London, to every retirement account, every fuel pump, every grocery receipt in the developed world. The Oxford Economics estimate for full strait closure sits at $10 trillion in cumulative global economic damage. That number has not appeared in any mainstream headline. It has not been broken down. It has not been shown as the sum of its parts. In the next 30 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly where every trillion of it comes from, why Dubai is the first city to burn, and why the succession crisis unfolding right now in Tehran may be the most dangerous 48 hours in the history of global energy markets. Ali Khamenei became supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran on June 4, 1989. He has held absolute authority over Iran's military, nuclear program, and foreign policy for 35 years. He controls the nuclear button. He controls IRGC deployment authority. He controls the Supreme National Security Council, the only body authorized to approve closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Under the Iranian constitution, no general, no president, no parliament can order a single warship into the strait without Khamenei's explicit written authorization. And Khamenei has not been seen since February 17th. Iranian state media last broadcast a live image of him at a ceremony in Mashhad. His hands shook. His left arm remained stationary throughout a 40-minute appearance. 2 attending clerics stood closer than protocol required. Diplomatic sources cited by Reuters on February 19th described him as having experienced a medical episode of unspecified severity within the previous week. The Reuters report was sourced to 3 individuals with knowledge of the supreme leader's inner circle. By February 20th, the hospital wing at Imam Khomeini Medical Complex, which has treated Khamenei for prostate cancer since at least 2014, according to reporting from the BBC Persian Service and The Guardian, had restricted access to all personnel except family and IRGC Commander Hossein Salami. The question every intelligence agency in Washington, Tel Aviv, Riyadh, and Abu Dhabi is asking right now is not whether Khamenei is dying. The question is, who has the nuclear authorization codes tonight? Wait, before I show you the succession mechanics, you need to understand the geography. Because the city that burns first is not Tehran. It is not Beirut. It is not Baghdad. It is Dubai. And most people watching this have never thought about why. Dubai sits 185 kilometers from the Iranian coastline across the Persian Gulf. That is the Dubai anatomy that no one explains. It is not a city that defends itself. It is a city that evacuates. It assumes a functioning government managing an orderly distribution system, not a city of 6 million people in acute crisis. Now, let me show you the first trillion. The Strait of Hormuz handles 20. 5 million barrels of crude oil per day, according to the United States Energy Information Administration's most recent verified count from January 2026, against global daily consumption of 103 million barrels. That represents 1 barrel in every 5 consumed anywhere on Earth. The countries most exposed are the ones with no bypass option. Japan sources 95% of its crude oil from the Middle East. 80% of those imports, approximately 85 million barrels per day, transit the strait. South Korea sources 70% of its crude through the strait, approximately 5 million barrels per day. India transits 2 million barrels per day through the strait, 40% of its total crude intake. China moves approximately 4 million barrels per day through the strait, half its total crude imports. Those 4 economies combined account for 69% of all crude flows through the strait. They are not peripheral actors. They are the manufacturing core of the global economy. Their factories produce the goods sold in every retail store in America and Europe. Their energy costs determine those goods' prices. JP Morgan analysts modeled a full strait closure in November 2025 and arrived at crude oil between $120 and $130 per barrel within 30 days of closure. Oxford Economics modeled the same scenario and produced $130 as its central case. The extreme scenario, sustained closure past 60 days with Iranian export infrastructure simultaneously struck, produces a number of those models labeled with one word: unanchored. The number I'm about to give you has not appeared in any mainstream outlet presented as a complete calculation. At $130 crude, the global economy pays an energy premium of approximately $65 per barrel above the pre-crisis baseline of $65 per barrel. Global consumption is 103 million barrels per day. $65 premium multiplied by 103 million barrels multiplied by 365 days equals $2, $4 trillion annually in excess energy costs above the pre-crisis baseline. That is component 1, $2.4 trillion per year, extracted from every economy on Earth that runs on oil, which is every economy on Earth. Component 2 is liquefied natural gas. Qatar is the world's largest LNG exporter, moving approximately 107 million tons of LNG per year. 100% of Qatar's LNG export capacity sits behind the Strait of Hormuz. Qatar supplies 15% of global LNG trade. European buyers who restructured their entire energy procurement strategy after the Ukraine war to depend on Qatari LNG instead of Russian pipeline gas now face a second simultaneous energy shock from a different direction. European natural gas prices, which peaked at 347 euros per megawatt hour during the 2022 crisis, would reach comparable or higher levels under sustained Qatari disruption, according to Bloomberg NEF modeling from December 2025. The European LNG disruption component adds $800 billion to the cumulative economic damage calculation when modeled across 1 year of supply disruption. That brings the running total to $2 trillion. And we have not yet touched financial markets. Component 3 is equity markets. The relationship between oil price shocks and stock market crashes is documented across 50 years of economic history. During the 1973 oil embargo, the S&P 500 lost 48% of its value between January 1973 and December 1974. During the 1979 Iranian Revolution and subsequent oil shock, the S&P lost 27%. During the Gulf War oil price spike of 1990, global equity markets lost approximately $5 trillion in market capitalization in a single week. Goldman Sachs published an equity market risk model in January 2026, estimating that sustained oil above $120 produces S&P 500 drawdown of 15 to 20%. Current S&P 500 market capitalization stands at approximately $48 trillion. A 15% drawdown removes $7.2 trillion. A 20% drawdown removes $9.6 trillion. Retirement accounts, pension funds, 401k plans, college savings, the accumulated wealth of every household in the developed world that owns equities, which in the United States is 58% of all households, according to Federal Reserve Survey data. That is component 3. The equity market loss alone, using Goldman's conservative 15% estimate, adds $2 trillion. The cumulative total is now $10. $4 trillion before we calculate insurance market seizure, real estate repricing, trade finance collapse, or the costs of the military operation itself. CNN's estimate of billions of dollars for the economic cost of this crisis was accurate in the same way that saying the ocean is wet is accurate. It is technically true and completely insufficient. But here is what no one is asking. The $10 trillion figure assumes the crisis is managed. It assumes governments respond rationally. It assumes central banks coordinate. It assumes the succession crisis in Tehran resolves within days rather than weeks, with a recognized authority figure who can either authorize or decline to authorize strait closure. Every one of those assumptions collapses the moment Khamenei dies without a functioning succession in place. And right now, there is no functioning succession in place. The Iranian constitution requires the assembly of experts, an 88-member body of senior Islamic scholars, to convene and select a new supreme leader within a legally unspecified but traditionally rapid time frame following the death of a sitting leader. The last time this happened was June 1989, when Khamenei himself was selected within days of Ayatollah Khamenei's death. But 1989 was a different Iran. There was no contested nuclear program under international sanction. There were no American carrier strike groups in the Arabian Sea. There was no formal targeting declaration filed with the United Nations. There was no IRGC command structure that had grown over 35 years to the point where its economic and military interests are now semi-autonomous from civilian authority. The succession candidates are 3, and none of them are clean. Mojtaba Khamenei is the supreme leader's son. He is 55 years old. He has never held formal political office. He has spent his career as a shadow operator inside the IRGC Intelligence Directorate, cultivating relationships with hardline commanders while his father provided the religious legitimacy that Mojtaba himself lacks. Under the Iranian constitution, the supreme leader must be a recognized Islamic jurist with demonstrated scholarly credentials. Mojtaba Khamenei's theological credentials are disputed by senior clerics, including members of the Assembly of Experts itself. His selection would be constitutionally contentious and would face immediate challenge from the clerical establishment. But he has the IRGC relationships, he has the intelligence apparatus, he has spent 20 years building the informal network that controls actual power in Iran regardless of constitutional procedure. The second candidate is Sadegh Larijani, former head of Iran's judiciary and current member of the Expediency Council. He is 64 years old, carries genuine theological credentials, and has relationships across both the clerical establishment and the security apparatus. He is acceptable to more factions than Mojtaba Khamenei. He is therefore less threatening to any single faction's dominance, which is precisely why multiple factions would prefer their own candidate. The third force is not a candidate. It is a structure. The IRGC, under Commander Hossein Salami, has, since the 2019 designation of the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization by the United States and the subsequent maximum pressure campaign, developed financial and operational autonomy that makes it capable of acting without supreme leader authorization in certain domains. Salami has publicly called for strait closure on 3 separate occasions. He does not have the constitutional authority to order it. But in a succession vacuum of 48 to 72 hours, with no recognized supreme leader, with the Supreme National Security Council lacking its chairperson, with American carrier strike groups 700 kilometers from Iranian territory, and a publicly stated deadline from the White House counting down, the question of who stops Salami from ordering a closure becomes operationally urgent in a way that diplomatic language cannot fully capture. That is the succession crisis mechanic, not a transfer of power, a power vacuum. And into a power vacuum of that magnitude, with that military configuration, in that geography, the forces that fill it are not the forces of constitutional order. In 30 seconds, I will show you exactly how the crisis spreads from the Persian Gulf to Singapore to Tokyo to London. But first, you need to understand what the strait closure looks like on day 1. Iran's strait closure capability does not require a formal naval engagement. It does not require a battle. The IRGC Navy operates more than 1,000 fast attack craft in the confined waters of the Persian Gulf, where they hold every geographic and numerical advantage. They operate shore-based anti-ship missiles, including the Noor system with a range of 170 kilometers, and the CM-302 supersonic missile with a range of 300 kilometers, covering the entire UAE coastline and most of the Gulf of Oman approaches. But the most effective closure mechanism is not missiles and it is not gunboats. It is mines. Naval mines deployed from small vessels at night in the inbound traffic separation scheme of the strait do not require detonation to stop traffic. They require discovery. The discovery of a single mine in the inbound lane of the Strait of Hormuz would not stop one vessel. It would stop all of them. Because no insurance underwriter in London, Tokyo, or New York would authorize coverage for a vessel entering a confirmed minefield. And without insurance, no vessel transits, no crew boards, no captain navigates. The mines do not need to sink tankers. They need to sit on the floor of the strait and be known to exist. Clearing a minefield in contested waters, where the mine-laying vessel is still operational and shore-based, missile batteries cover the clearing area, is not an operation measured in days. The United States Navy's mine countermeasures force, based on historical operational timelines from the Persian Gulf mine clearance operations of 1987 and 1988, requires weeks to clear a mined shipping lane under hostile conditions. During that time, 20.5 million barrels of oil per day stops moving. The Saudi East-West pipeline can divert 5 million barrels per day to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. The UAE's Habshan-Fujairah pipeline can divert 5 million barrels per day to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman. Combined alternative routing covers 5 million barrels per day. The remaining 14 million barrels per day has nowhere to go. Iraq exports 4 million barrels per day through the strait. Iraq has no pipeline alternative. Iraqi government revenue is 90% oil dependent. With strait closure, Iraqi exports stop within 48 hours of mine deployment. The Iraqi government's payroll timeline without oil revenue is approximately 6 weeks. What follows through 6 weeks of unpaid military and civil service salaries in Iraq is not an economist's question. It is a political stability question with a documented historical answer. Kuwait exports 5 million barrels per day through the strait. No alternative route. Bahrain's economy ceases to function as a financial center the moment regional stability evaporates. Qatar's LNG revenues disappear with the tankers. What happened next was not what anyone predicted. The global contagion mechanism is not oil prices. Oil prices are the announcement. The contagion mechanism is insurance, and it moves faster than any political response. The moment the first confirmed mine report reaches the Lloyd's of London War Risk Committee, every vessel currently in the Persian Gulf becomes operationally stranded. Vessels cannot leave a minefield that has not been cleared. Vessels outside cannot enter without coverage. The 3,000 vessels that transit the Strait every month include supertankers carrying up to 2 million barrels each. A very large crude carrier, 330 meters long and 60 meters wide, cannot be rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope on 24 hours' notice. It cannot be repositioned. It is either in the Strait or it is not. And if it is not, and it was supposed to be, the crude it was carrying does not arrive at its destination refinery on schedule. South Korean refineries processing 1. 5 million barrels of straight crude per day run at full capacity until their existing tankage is exhausted. Industrial tankage for crude oil is typically measured in days to weeks of operational buffer, not months. When those buffers exhaust, refinery throughput drops. When refinery throughput drops, domestic fuel production drops. When domestic fuel production drops, retail fuel prices spike within days of the initial closure because the retail market reprices on futures, not on physical delivery timelines. Seoul's government has a strategic petroleum reserve equivalent to approximately 200 days of supply at normal consumption. That sounds sufficient until you calculate what normal consumption means for South Korea's industrial base. South Korea is the world's 7th largest steel producer, the 5th largest shipbuilder, and a top 5 manufacturer of semiconductors. Semiconductors require continuous power. Steel furnaces require continuous fuel. Shipyards require continuous energy input. Rationing to 80% of normal consumption does not produce 80% of normal industrial output. It produces shutdowns, because industrial processes are binary below certain energy thresholds. Factories that cannot maintain furnace temperature stop producing. They do not produce less. They produce nothing. The transmission from Hormuz closure to empty semiconductor fabrication plants in South Korea, to delayed chip shipments to computer manufacturers in Taiwan and mainland China, to product launch delays at Apple, Dell, and every electronics manufacturer in the world is not a theoretical supply chain model. It is the actual supply chain operating in reverse on a timeline of weeks rather than months. Singapore processes approximately 800,000 barrels per day of Middle Eastern crude and functions as the primary refining hub for all of Southeast Asia. Singapore's Jurong Island refinery complex is the 3rd largest refining center in the world. A strait closure that traps Singapore's crude supply inside the Persian Gulf does not only affect Singapore, it affects every country in Southeast Asia that purchases refined products from Jurong Island. The 10 nations of ASEAN are collectively net oil importers. Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, the Philippines, Cambodia all depend on petroleum products refined from Middle Eastern crude moving through Hormuz to Singapore and then distributed across the region. The transmission from Hormuz closure to fuel shortage in Manila or Bangkok is not measured in months. It is measured in weeks. And fuel shortages in the Philippines do not produce managed government responses. They produce the kind of social pressure that destabilizes governments with approval ratings that are already marginal. London prices this before Manila even begins rationing. The ICE Brent crude futures contract is the global benchmark. It trades 24 hours a day. The moment mine discovery is confirmed, ICE Brent moves, not gradually, instantly. Traders who have been positioned for this scenario, and there are traders, positioned for this scenario according to CFTC positioning data showing elevated crude options, open interest at $130 and $150 strike prices through late 2025 and into 2026, execute their positions simultaneously. The bid-ask spread blows out. Liquidity evaporates. The price discovery mechanism that normally sets global oil prices in an orderly fashion seizes. When oil markets seize, everything priced in oil seizes with it. Airline fuel hedges, which every major carrier maintains for 6 to 18 months of forward fuel consumption, become insufficient at $130 crude if they were purchased at $70. Airlines cannot absorb the unhedged portion. Ticket prices spike within weeks. Airlines that cannot survive the fuel cost increase begin filing restructuring notices. American Airlines, which entered 2026 with a debt-to-equity ratio that left it structurally vulnerable to cost shocks according to its Q3 2025 10K filing, is the most exposed legacy carrier. That is not analysis. That is the company's own financial disclosure. The New York angle is the one mainstream media never connects. Component 4 in the $10 trillion calculation is U.S. consumer inflation. Federal Reserve modeling, cited in congressional testimony by Fed Chair Jerome Powell in December 2025, estimates that sustained crude oil above $100 per barrel adds 1. 5 percentage points to the consumer price index within 90 days. At $130 crude, the CPI addition is at the higher end of that range. Current CPI running at 3. 1% according to Bureau of Labor Statistics. January 2026, data becomes 5. 6% within 1 quarter of straight closure. Gas prices at $3.80 per gallon in the U.S. Northeast as of February 2026 reach $6.20 at $130 crude, based on the historical ratio of pump price to crude price documented by the EIA across 3 previous oil price shocks. American households spend on average $3,700 annually on gasoline, according to the Consumer Expenditure Survey. At $6.20 per gallon, that figure rises to approximately $6,200. The $2,500 annual increase for every driving household in America is not an abstraction. It is the vacation that does not happen. It is the restaurant meal that becomes a home-cooked substitute. It is the small business that cannot absorb higher delivery costs and raises prices. It is inflation that the Federal Reserve cannot fight without raising interest rates into an economy already showing signs of the very slowdown that rate cuts were meant to prevent. The Fed's dilemma is binary, and both options are bad. Raise rates to fight oil-driven inflation. Trigger recession in an economy with $35 trillion in national debt, and watch the federal deficit explode as tax revenues fall and mandatory spending rises. Do not raise rates, let inflation run, and watch the 1970s stagflation replay in an economy that is 3 times larger and exponentially more financialized than it was then. Component 5 is the commercial real estate and banking exposure. Dubai's $3 trillion real estate market is not held primarily by Emirati nationals. It is held by international investors, by Russian oligarchs who moved capital there after 2022 sanctions, by Indian business families, by British and European buyers who purchased units in the wave of development that followed Dubai's post-COVID luxury market expansion. The CBRE Gulf Market Report from Q4 2025 shows that foreign nationals hold approximately 74% of Dubai's investment property by value. When those 74% of holders attempt to liquidate simultaneously as crisis approaches, the bid disappears. There is no domestic buyer base large enough to absorb that selling pressure. Dubai real estate values, which appreciated 47% between 2022 and 2025, according to Property Finder market data, can reverse a comparable percentage in weeks when confidence collapses. The banks holding mortgages and development financing against Dubai real estate assets are not only UAE-based institutions. Emirates NBD, Abu Dhabi Commercial Bank, and First Abu Dhabi Bank hold the largest domestic exposures. But HSBC, Standard Chartered, and Deutsche Bank all hold material Gulf real estate and trade finance exposure. The $385 billion in DIFC processed transactions includes trade finance instruments, letters of credit, and commodity financing that are directly tied to the flow of physical goods through Jebel Ali Port. When Jebel Ali Port faces missile threat, those instruments become uncollectible. When those instruments become uncollectible, the banks that issued them recognize losses. When banks recognize losses at this scale simultaneously, the word that appears in Federal Reserve emergency meeting agendas is the same word that appeared in Tooling 8. Component 6 is the insurance market itself. Lloyd's of London war risk premiums on Persian Gulf vessels have been rising since January 26th, when the USS Abraham Lincoln arrived in the Arabian Sea. Before any shot is fired, before any mine is laid, before any closure is declared, the insurance market is already pricing the probability. Every basis point increase in war risk premiums adds cost to every cargo transiting the Gulf. Every cargo cost increase is ultimately borne by the buyer of the cargo. The buyer of crude oil is the refinery. The buyer of refined products is the consumer. The transmission is mechanical and inexorable. The cumulative 6-component total is $10 trillion across a 12-month sustained crisis scenario. That figure comes from building the components exactly as I have shown them. $2, $4 trillion in global energy premium, $800 billion in European LNG disruption, $7, $2 trillion in equity market drawdown at Goldman's conservative 15% estimate, $400 billion in U.S. consumer inflation costs, $600 billion in commercial real estate and banking losses across the Gulf and globally exposed institutions, and $200 billion in insurance market seizure and trade finance collapse. The real number, if the crisis persists beyond 12 months, if the succession vacuum extends the decision-making paralysis in Tehran, if the IRGC acts without authorization in ways that trigger a direct military exchange with American carrier strike groups, is not $10 trillion. No model contains it. Now, the historical parallel that makes this moment different from every previous straight crisis. In 1973, the Arab oil embargo removed approximately 5 million barrels per day from global supply, roughly 7% of total global consumption at the time. It triggered a 400% oil price increase, a stock market crash that eliminated 48% of the S&P 500's value over 23 months, and a recession that lasted until 1975. That disruption came from a political decision by producing nations acting in coordination, with warning, over weeks, against an economy that was less financialized, less globally integrated, and less dependent on continuous energy supply chain function than the one that exists today. The strait closure scenario is not like 1973. It is like 1973, but the disruption is larger, faster, applied to an economy 7 times larger in real terms, more interconnected through financial systems that transmit crisis in milliseconds rather than weeks, more dependent on just-in-time supply chains that carry zero buffer against disruption, and triggered not by a coordinated political embargo, but by a succession vacuum in a nuclear-adjacent state whose military command structure has publicly declared its intent to close the strait if attacked. The precedent for what happens to oil markets when a Middle Eastern leader dies during a period of active military tension is documented. When Saddam Hussein was executed in December 2006, Brent crude rose 7% in 24 hours, despite the execution being anticipated. When Muammar Gaddafi was killed in October 2011, Libyan oil production, approximately 5 million barrels per day, had already been disrupted for months. The market's response to the confirmed death was a further 4% rally in crude prices on reintegration uncertainty rather than supply concerns. Both of those deaths involved recognized successors and functional state continuity. Khamenei's death produces neither. The U.S. military positioning in the region as of February 2026 represents the largest American naval buildup in the Persian Gulf since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group arrived in the Arabian Sea on January 26th, carrying approximately 5,700 personnel and operating 700 kilometers from Iranian territorial waters. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the world's largest aircraft carrier, was ordered to the region February 13th and is closing distance with its own strike group of 3 destroyers and more than 5,000 additional service members. When the Ford reaches operational position, 2 carrier strike groups will be available for simultaneous strike operations against targets distributed across Iranian territory. Pentagon sources cited by NPR assessed full forces ready by mid-March. At Diego Garcia, the joint American-British base in the Indian Ocean, B-2 Spirit stealth bombers are positioned within operational range of Iranian nuclear facilities. President Trump named Diego Garcia explicitly in a Truth Social post on February 18th, a targeting declaration of the launch platform that prompted Iran's February 19th letter to the United Nations, formally designating all American regional bases as legitimate military targets. 40 to 50,000 American service members across 19 locations in 8 countries woke the following morning in a world where their installations had been formally identified as military objectives. This is not hypothetical. The letters exist in United Nations archives. The carrier strike groups are at sea. The B-2 bombers are at Diego Garcia. The hospital wing at Imam Khomeini Medical Complex is sealed. And the IRGC commander, who has publicly called for strait closure 3 times, is currently the most senior Iranian military official, with confirmed access to the supreme leader. Here is the binary dilemma that no analyst has stated plainly. If Khamenei dies and a recognized successor emerges within 48 hours, who has the political credibility to restrain the IRGC hardliners, to decline strait closure, to continue the nuclear negotiations currently underway, then the crisis is severe but manageable. Oil reaches $100 to $110 per barrel. Markets fall 8%. Recession risk rises but does not materialize. The $10 trillion scenario does not execute. If Khamenei dies and no recognized successor emerges within 48 hours, the IRGC command structure operates in an authorization vacuum, with American carrier strike groups 700 kilometers away, a White House deadline running, and a formal targeting declaration already filed with the United Nations. In that vacuum, the individual most likely to fill it is the individual with the most weapons and the least to lose from using them. Neither outcome is within the control of any government in Washington, Brussels, Tokyo, or Riyadh. Both outcomes are determined by what happens in the next 72 hours inside one hospital wing in Tehran that no outsider can see into. The gold market already knows. Spot gold moved through $3,200 per troy ounce in late February trading, an all-time record, as investors moved simultaneously out of equities and into physical stores of value for the first time since the acute phase of the 2022 Ukraine energy crisis. The volume of options contracts purchasing protection against S&P 500 declines of 20% or more. The CBOE put-call ratio reached its highest reading since March 2020, according to exchange data. These are not predictions. These are bets being placed right now by institutional investors with access to the same intelligence assessments that every government in the developed world is currently receiving through classified channels. The Japanese government maintains a strategic petroleum reserve equivalent to 150 days of supply. South Korea holds 200 days. China's reserve provides 90 to 120 days. The IEA's combined member reserve capacity covers approximately 111 days of the disrupted volume if drawn at maximum rate. Those numbers, stacked together, sound like a buffer. They are not. They are a window during which a solution must be found. No solution exists that does not involve either reopening the strait or permanently restructuring the energy infrastructure of 35 economies. Neither happens in 111 days. After 111 days, the reserves are gone. And what the market price is when strategic reserves are visibly depleting is not a risk premium. It is a scarcity price, a price that reflects genuine physical shortage of a commodity that modern industrial civilization cannot function without. $150 per barrel is not JP Morgan's central case. It is not Oxford Economics' base scenario.